Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Sarah Skowinski, and I am the Adult Services Director at Portland Public Library. Tonight's event is part of our sustainability series, which we are thrilled to host along with our partners at the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. In fact, this is our 5th season collaborating on the sustainability series. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Burton, Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, to introduce our program this evening on One Climate Future. Jess?
Thanks, Sarah. Wow, 5 years. That's amazing. The Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative is a network of land and water conservation organizations. And one of our mission buckets is to broaden the conversation of conservation and seek opportunities to partner with aligned community organizations like the Portland Public Library. So we're really excited about this partnership, and we're really excited about tonight to welcome Troy back for the 3rd time. He has been here with us for the last 2 Decembers. So hearing updates on this amazing project for the city of Portland. Troy is the sustainability coordinator for the city of Portland. And without much more ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Troy.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. So great. Again, I'm really excited to be back for my 3rd year in a row, kind of my annual update and presentation on what the Sustainability Office is doing. And certainly the biggest thing we've been working on recently is our One Climate Future climate action and adaptation plan that we've been working on with the city of South Portland. And so hopefully you've heard a little bit about it. But so tonight I'm going to cover some of the details, and then we'll have a chance to hopefully at the end to have some discussion about it. So just a little bit about us. I've been with the city for about 23 years now. So I've been doing this full-time sustainability gig for 4 or 5 years. But I started back in 1997, actually, working on the solid waste program. So the first big thing I worked on as a city employee was the curbside recycling program and pay as you throw. So what's now the purple bags. That's nice to see that's still going strong after all those years. We've done climate work for much of the time as well. We did our first greenhouse gas inventory back in 2001, did another one in 2005. We created our first climate action plan in 2008. And I've had the chance to work in sort of diverse parts of the city as well. I managed the parks department for a while and got really familiar with our parks and open spaces, which are such a great asset to the city. And having been with the city a long time, it's kind of a great, it's really valuable to have those connections internally and have colleagues around the city who can collaborate on the projects. But certainly as the sustainability person, I need to work really closely with my colleagues in other departments to implement a lot of the great programs that we want to do. So kind of one of the reasons we're here tonight is to talk about the One Climate Future plan, which we're so excited was adopted by our city council on November 9th. And it's a collaborative plan with our friends in the city of South Portland. And it's one of the only joint plans developed by municipalities that we're aware of. So our climate action plan in Portland is the same climate action plan that they have in South Portland. And we spent a lot of time over the last 18 months working together to bring this together. We talked to literally thousands of people in both communities. We did surveys. We did in-person outreach. We had a lot of in-person workshops. When COVID came, we did online workshops. We had some volunteers who were gracious to help spread the message and met with their friends and neighbors. And we had actually some volunteers did workshops with their yoga studios. We had workshops at churches, in public parks where people could just come up and learn. So it was really a great process to talk about climate change and its impacts on the community, but also to get feedback from all all cross sections of people in the community. So we just really enjoyed meeting with people and learning from them and sharing what we know as well. So. And one of the reasons we're doing this is because our city council set the goal to reduce our carbon emissions 80% by 2050, and also to have the city run all of its operations on renewable energy by 2040. So we had that in mind as we began the climate action process. If you recall, about a year ago, there was a lot of action from youth who are very concerned about what the future holds for them if we don't get climate change under control. So our council, at the urging of the youth activists, declared a climate emergency. So though our formal goal is to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050, our climate emergency declaration suggests that we need to do our best to reduce emissions as much as possible by 2030. And so we're happy that our council has been active on climate for a long time. And in some ways, our first climate emergency declaration was back in 2007 with the mayor's, the Sustainable Portland report that basically said that, recognize climate change is perhaps the greatest challenge to Portland since the Great Fire of 1866. And as my good colleague, Bill Needleman, who is our waterfront coordinator, says, if anytime you pull out the Great Fire card, that means you're really serious. And climate change certainly is serious. And we're going to be taking some actions to address it. Because we've known for a long time that CO2 emissions are going up rapidly. So I like to show this slide, and if you're not familiar with this gentleman, that's Dr. James Hansen, and this is him speaking to the Congress in 1988. And he was alerting our elected officials that greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuels are changing our climate. And if we don't address it, we're going to start having serious problems. And so it was kind of big news at the time. It was headlines, New York Times ran a headline. And it definitely inspired the first generation of climate activists. And since we're at a library, so to speak, right now, it's probably appropriate to mention that, Bill McKibben wrote his first book in 1989, basically partly inspired by Dr. Hansen's testimony. So, we've had that warning, in 1988, but what's happened since then? You can see on this chart that shows how carbon emissions have gone up over the years. If you see the line pointing to 1988, that's when Dr. Hansen gave his warning to us all, and you'll also see that after that warning, we've actually emitted more CO2 into the atmosphere than in all the years prior to the warning. So not only did we not listen, we just keep doing the wrong thing. So back when I was born in 1966, this atmospheric carbon was about 322 parts per million. So here we are about back then down here, but since that time, we've gone straight up, basically in a historical time zone. We're now at about, as of today, 414 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. So again, definitely going the wrong way. The last time the CO2 was this high in our atmosphere, it was kind of a different planet. The average global temperature is about 4 degrees centigrade higher, almost like about 7.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And, kind of concerningly, at that point in the Pliocene era, seas were about 25 meters higher than they are right now. So really, really different planet than we have now. And of course, having the carbon in the atmosphere is what raises our temperatures. And I pulled this headline today off Bloomberg Green with a headline that global temperatures have already perhaps reached 1.2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. And if you recall, the Paris Climate Accord goals were to keep global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees C, but really try hard to keep it to 1.5. So unless we change course pretty soon, we're going to be seeing some very high temperatures by by the mid-century and certainly by later in the century. And as a coastal community, one of the things that we are most concerned about and people ask about a lot is like what's going to happen to sea level rise. We have lots of things that we care a lot about right on the water's edge, on the commercial street and the back cove, and we see water rising rapidly. You can see, and historically, we've seen increase over the past 100 years. 8 inches. On average, in some places is higher, a little bit higher, and in some places a little bit lower. But the trajectory is what is the problem. And we've talked a lot about bending curves over the past year, past 9 months or so. But in the sea level rise curve, it's bending entirely the wrong way because rise is accelerating as water warms, as the seas warm, they expand. They get thermal expansion. As the warmer gets warmer, it expands. Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets are melting more and more rapidly, and certainly around the world, global mountain glaciers are receding at a kind of an alarming rate. So back in September, there was a Hurricane Teddy was offshore, and I decided I would go down to Portland Pier at high tide to see what I could see. And I rolled up on my bike and I found this right at high tide. So it was a 12 foot tide, a little bit more than 12 feet, which is 2 feet higher than what the normal high tide is in Portland. And you can see that going out, if you wanted to go to dinner at Luke's Lobster on September 2nd, that you would have gotten your feet very wet. Because the pier was underwater, and there were a lot of people who were standing around and noted that they hadn't seen the water this high, and it wasn't a record tide, but it was a pretty high tide. And what's interesting is that if we look at our sea level rise projections, basically what we're planning for to see by 2050 is almost 2 feet of sea level rise. So by 2050. What we saw at Portland Pier on September 22nd might be what you see every day. So that would certainly change the use of the properties on the pier and in nearby properties. But also by 2100, we should expect to manage over 4 feet of sea level rise, which again is like twice as high as what we saw there. So if that was a 4 feet above, if that was a 14-foot tide, water would have been well onto Commercial Street. So that definitely changes how people would be able to interact with the properties down there. But kind of what's of great concern is if globally we aren't taking better steps to mitigate climate emissions, carbon emissions, it's not out of the question to see 10 or more feet of sea level rise by 2100. So that's again a city that it's a different city than we live in today, and certainly the waterfront resources that we enjoy would not be available to us. But sea level rise is only part of our concerns for climate change. Health is a huge issue as well, and certainly something that we're concerned about now with COVID. But we know that high temperatures, heat is really the leading cause of death and illness from weather-related sources. So we know that by in 2050, we're expecting to see about 3 degrees Fahrenheit higher average temperature here in Maine than we do now. Temperatures have increased about 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the last century, and by 2050, 3 more degrees. So our climate is going to be more of what you might be accustomed to down in like the mid-Atlantic states by then. And so we'll see days that are above 90 degrees with great regularity. And those are the types of, we need to start thinking about how do we help people stay cool and avoid heat-related illnesses. And so Mainers aren't really accustomed to that. We have, older homes that aren't air conditioned. So we need to, how do we help people, particularly people who are elderly or with respiratory illnesses, stay healthy in hot temperatures. We know ticks and other vectors who carry diseases are going to be more widespread. You see maps of the spread of Lyme disease as our average temperatures increase and our winters become less severe. It's exploding And so that's going to be a more significant problem. And, bad news is that if you are allergic to tree pollen, Maine is actually a hotspot for increased, increased problems from pollen as tree species migrate north and we have more pollen trees emitting pollen. So more things that we can work on trying to avoid. So what are we going to do about all this? That's one of the questions, the main question that we've been asking ourselves over the last 18 months. We've certainly identified the hazards, a lot of the hazards, and that was just a summary. We created a pretty comprehensive vulnerability assessment as part of One Climate Future that we certainly invite you to look at. It's on oneclimatefuture.org. You can download a copy of the actual climate action plan, but also the vulnerability assessment. And it gets into a lot of detail and certainly encourage you to have a look at it. But so now we have a plan. We know basically what to do. The technology that we think we need to deploy, it's available and it's only getting better. We know how to build climate-ready communities, and we understand the policy tools that we need to employ to get there. But the question is, are we really committed to doing it? And that's a question that we're all going to figure out together over the next, the next coming decades. The objective of our climate action plan is that we, Portland and South Portland and all our members of our community work together to create thriving, vibrant, and inclusive communities now and in the future. And so in order to do that, and in order to continue to thrive in the future, we're going to have to do things a little bit differently than we've been doing them in recent years. And doing things differently doesn't necessarily mean that it's worse, it means that it's different. And I would pose the question is, what if what we do differently is actually better? And it makes me think about this old cartoon that was created by a cartoonist called Joel Pett, who works at the Kentucky Herald Leader. Many of you may have seen this before. We know that we're pretty confident and know that climate change certainly isn't a hoax, but all the actions that we want to take are great. We want to be energy independent. It's something that people of a variety of political perspectives have talked about for a long time. We want to have good jobs, and we can have green jobs, and we like clean air and healthy children and renewable energy. So those are all things that we want to achieve, both as a nation and certainly as a region working on our One Climate Future plan. So we think that our thriving planet can be maybe even nicer if we undertake some of the actions that we're proposing in One Climate Future. So as we get going, I wanted to take a little bit of stock in where our emissions are coming from in Portland and South Portland. So we know that largely in Portland, our building sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases at about 60%. And that's different than Maine. If you listened to the governor and the Maine Climate Council yesterday, you know that in statewide, transportation makes up more than half of Maine's carbon emissions. But Portland and South Portland are more built up, and so our building sector is a bit more. Our emission, 30% of our emissions come from the transportation sector. And then, between some industrial emissions and emissions from waste comes second. So we know we have to take actions in those areas in order to achieve our 80% by 2050 reductions. And so we did a wedge analysis to kind of put on, kind of visually show the types of policy implementation we need to make to achieve that 80% reduction. Where are they going to come from? You can see the big yellow stripe in the middle of this chart is actually a policy that was enacted by the state of Maine. It's what's called the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So we have a goal in Maine that by 2050, 100% of the electricity that we use in our homes and businesses will be generated by green electricity, by renewable sources. And that's, as a very significant part of our plan to reduce emissions. We also know we need solar and, existing buildings, the blue sections up there are buildings. So existing buildings are a bigger chunk because we have an old building stock here in Portland. So all the square footage of buildings in Portland today, most of that square footage is still going to be here in 2050. So it'll be up to us to figure out how to clean those up and, make them more energy efficient and run on, renewable electricity. And also we need building codes to be improved. So we're on track for new buildings to be net zero buildings. And we also want to get people out of vehicles. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of those specific elements as we go forward. So I mentioned building sector is super important for achieving our goals. And we know that we can do this. So in the picture on the screen, that's a building that exists here in Portland. It's Bayside Anchor. It's a joint project by Avesta and Portland Housing Authority. And what's really exciting about this building is it's a passive house standard building. So it is really, really low carbon emitting building. I mean, in fact, it doesn't even have a central heating system. It's heated with electricity. It has rooftop solar to power much of the building. And, it's cozy and warm, very, weather sealed, has a community garden. And it's just a really nice place to live. And what it shows is that you can build really great buildings and be affordable, because affordable housing has to meet very, very strict financing goals and targets to get funded. The Maine Housing Authority sets those standards, and they have to score buildings. And in order to get built, they have to score very high in terms of their cost effectiveness. So and I like to point this building out to people in the development community who complain that green building is too expensive. And I mentioned that if affordable housing developments can build passive house standard buildings, which is a very high standard, then they can do that too. But it just again sets the goal that in moving forward, we need better buildings like this that are resilient. And we're also going to be talking about where we build buildings and how we build them in places that are vulnerable. So for instance, on Commercial Street, where we just observed is vulnerable to sea level rise, we need to start making some rules about what's an appropriate building to build there, and what sort of measures should the city require developers to take to make sure that their buildings and the occupants in those buildings are safe from rising seas, and also don't contribute to carbon emissions and stormwater issues. So better buildings will help protect people as well as property. And so this is a map we made a little while ago that shows basically, shows what types of heating units are used in residential homes in Portland. We haven't done this for the commercial sector, but I'm sure it's very similar. But you can see the kind of the orange creamsicle color is oil. That's so by a large majority, people in Portland heat their homes with oil, and that's the same throughout the state. We're really, really relying on oil. We also have some gas and just a little bit of electric heat. And hopefully those are heat pumps. But so we know that we have a large task ahead of us to convert these oil furnaces to electricity, to heat pumps or something similar, so we can not emit carbon from heating and cooling our homes. We also know we need to weatherize these buildings too, because again, these buildings, many of these homes are old and maybe not very well insulated. So that's going to be a big task. But I'd like to pose that yes, it is a challenge and a large task, but in some ways it's also an opportunity. Particularly now as we come out of COVID and we know that our economy is struggling and people need jobs. So weatherization and doing the work in these homes and businesses to make them ready for a climate future is it's work that can't be outsourced. So it's local jobs to do that work, to install heat pumps, to put up insulation and new windows. It's and electricians to install to install solar panels and heat pumps. So it's technical skills and trade skills. And so those are good paying jobs that need to be performed right here in Portland. So that's one thing that, again, and certainly Governor Mills' plan that she announced yesterday includes that type of thinking as well. So electrification, as I kind of alluded to, is a really key part of the One Climate Future plan. We like to say that our goal is to electrify everything. We kind of mean almost everything. There's definitely a few things that are difficult to electrify. So some industrial processes and some large kitchen operations that will have trouble being fully electric, but pretty much everything else needs to be electric, from heating and cooling into transportation. You certainly want to see a lot more electric cars and buses and trucks moving forward. So solar is a huge part of that. You saw the big yellow slice in the wedge analysis. That's the renewable portfolio standard. That's solar built all around the state. But we want to build a lot of solar right here in Portland to meet our renewable energy needs as well. So these are pictures of buildings and solar arrays that exist here in Portland. And I'm really excited by the one in the top left corner, which is a privately owned apartment building on Anderson Street. And the owner of the building, basically, it's a 10-unit building, and they have installed a solar array for every one of the units, really setting the trend that we hope continues and becomes more common. Right now, that's certainly a cutting edge building in terms of solar, but we want to see that happen more and more as we move forward. And so we'll need to think about how do we incentivize and create opportunities for property owners to do things like that. On the upper right is the Portland Jetport. We have, and currently it's the largest rooftop solar array in the state of Maine. It, may not be for too much longer, but it's about around 300 megawatts, 350 megawatts. So it's a pretty good size. If you've ever been up on the roof, it runs the whole length of the upper deck of the Jetport parking garage. The bottom left one, if you've seen me speak, you've seen me mention that one before. That's the Ocean Avenue array that's on the old closed landfill. It's a 1 megawatt array here in Portland. And we certainly want to see more and more homes install solar on their roofs as well. Ultimately, we want to see about 245 megawatts of solar in Portland. And so kind of to think about how we might be able to accomplish that, we actually worked with a group called Grid Solar, and they actually mapped the rooftop solar potential of every building in Cumberland County, which is going to be a great tool and asset for us and for our colleagues around the state to be able to use this to think about where can we try to build solar, and where can we encourage building owners to think about that as well. So technology is really getting to be pretty cool with what you can do with maps. And next, I want to talk a little bit about land use. Certainly going to be a huge contributor to achieving our goals. And we work really closely with our colleagues in the planning department, because how we build the city and how we get around the city will definitely impact our CO2 emissions. And we talked about how do we make things better, perhaps. So I'd kind of invite you to think about some of your favorite places in Portland. I like to visit the Old Port. You can walk around. There's many shops and restaurants and things to see. Some little parks where you can sit down and chat with people. So that's downtown. Most people expect that you can do that sort of thing in the downtown. But then if you walk a little further and you end up in either on Munjoy Hill or the West End, it's similar. It's not as doesn't have as many shops, but you can still walk to stores. You can walk to a park. You can maybe walk to work. But you can, you see people in the street, you see your neighbors, and that's, people, there's a reason why Munjoy Hill is one of the most popular places to live now. People move here from around the world because it's a great place to live. But, but that type of neighborhood isn't necessarily just exclusive to the peninsula. In Portland, we have other great neighborhoods. So I live fairly close to Deering Center. And if you visited Portland on Stevens Avenue, you know that another place you can kind of walk around. There's a lot of homes and some multifamily buildings, and there's restaurants. There's, Pat's Meat Mart. That's, a butcher shop that's been, on Stevens Avenue for over 100 years. Some restaurants, coffee shop. And, famously, you can go to kindergarten through college without ever leaving Stevens Avenue. So it's a great compact neighborhood, that people really enjoy living in. And so what's great about those places is each one of them has its own sense of character, which is what people love about neighborhoods. And so that's kind of the vision. When we talk about that type of neighborhood as a complete neighborhood where you can get around and do things without having to drive cars. You can, you get to know your neighbors to help build social resilience. Again, people who know each other and interact on a personal level are more apt to help each other if there's like a time of crisis or a shock or a terrible storm. So there's just lots of benefits for those types of walkable communities. And as we develop in Portland's master plan, the Plan 2030 talks a lot about that. How do we create authentic, sustainable neighborhoods that people can move around in without having to, drive cars? And so, how are we getting there? So Woodford's Corner, that's the place that a lot of people in Portland know as an annoying place where you get stuck at a light. But it has a lot of opportunity, and we're really starting to see it come to life. A few years ago, the city and the state made some nice investments in that traffic corridor. So they widened made this cars. We created a slip, some lanes to help the cars move through a little more clearly. We added some great pedestrian infrastructure, so better sidewalks, curb cuts, and pedestrian signals that make it much easier to walk across. We created a nice plaza with some art. And now we're seeing more and more businesses starting to locate there. So restaurants are coming. Maybe you've gone to have dinner at one of the restaurants there. And people are, and it's starting to come to life. And now there's a really active neighborhood association that advocates for Woodford's Corner, the Friends of Woodford's Corner, and they do programming to bring more people to the neighborhood and to help their neighbors get to know each other and do fun things in that neighborhood. So that's the type of thing that we want to inspire more of, is building these compute neighborhoods. And certainly one thing that's great about a place like Woodford's Corner is that it's right on that really annoying intersection because it's on a bus route. So the number 2 Metro bus goes through Woodford's Corner fairly. It's probably the best Metro route going currently. Has really good frequency, and you can go back and forth on Forest Avenue quite easily. And I live out that way and am known to ride the bus too, because it takes just a few minutes to get from downtown, from City Hall to my house on the bus. So that's what we're trying to encourage more people to be able to do, is be able to use transit to make it effective. And so we hope to see more investments in transit moving forward, because mode shift is going to be really key to getting towards that 30% of emissions that come from transportation. Right now, about 87% of all the trips in Portland happen in single occupant cars. So our goal is to get away from that. So with complete neighborhoods where people can do what they need to do close to home, that's one way to do it. But we also want to make sure we develop infrastructure that people can walk, ride their bikes, and again, take the bus much more easily. So you can see in the kind of on the right in the middle, it's like that's our Park Avenue bike lane. That's the first separated bike lane in Portland. It's I suspect we'll see more of that going forward. But we do have painted bike lanes on all of the major arterials going out of the city. But we have also what we call urban byways. So we've created maps and routes with signage that people can take to get around the city without having to go onto major roads. And so it's much more enjoyable to cycle that way. And you can see the bottom picture is one of our first Friday events from several years ago, but walking is super important. And we want to definitely encourage people to walk as much as possible, to stop being, in those 87% that are in cars. We want to get that down to 60% by 2050. So that doesn't sound like a huge drop, but if you talk to traffic planners and engineers, if you think you want to move it 1%, they get all excited because they say that's hard. So we know we have some work to do, but we think we can do it. And we do know that cars are going to be part of the transportation future for a long time, and some people they're definitely useful, and we're going to we need to think about how do we transition people from internal combustion engine cars to electric transportation, electric cars. So as part of that effort, we've recently unveiled some EV chargers. We put one right here in front of City Hall that's actually proven to be pretty popular so far. It's pretty often that I see people tied up to it, and we've just publicized it just last week. We also have chargers at Payson Park. The Portland Jetport has chargers in both the long-term parking and the short-term parking, and we have plans to put chargers in the parking lot at the corner of State and High, kind of near right across from the little tap house there on corner of Spring and High Street, and also the Bat Cove parking lot. Once they get done digging up the new big water storage conduit there, we'll put in EV chargers there. So for people who are coming to use the Bat Cove Trail, they'll be able to charge their car while they walk around the trail. So we also have plans to electrify our fleet. City right now has 5 electric vehicles that we use for, like the Parks Department uses them, and our building inspections folks. We definitely have plans for more of those. We also have just purchased, it's on order, our first electric heavy duty truck. It's a big Class 8, the heaviest, truck that we would use in our fleet. And it's a trash truck, and we should be getting that next year. So we're excited to be doing that. So again, look forward for more electric transportation. We want to see by 2050, all of the cars being sold should be electric. And so we're building infrastructure for that future. So finally, we want to get to waste reduction. Portland actually has been a leader in terms of reducing our waste and recycling over the years. And I mentioned that I started in the solid waste field. So back in the late 90s, we used to not have recycling. So we threw away lots and lots of stuff. So back in 1998, this chart begins, we threw away, as Portland residents, 23,000 tons of trash that went to the waste energy plant. And at that point, it was like less than 1,000 tons of recycling. You can see we started the pay-as-you-throw program. The first full year was the FY 00, and you can see that our disposal rates dropped and our recycling rates went up pretty dramatically. And we've been kind of on a downward trend ever since. So right now we dispose of about 9,500 tons of trash a year, which is over that past 20 years, we've reduced our waste by 60%. And believe it or not, Portlanders have one of the lowest per capita waste generations of any town in the country. So something we can be proud of. But we have a long ways to go, and particularly in organics. Right now, there are a couple of little companies that do curbside composting by subscription, but we need to think of ways to get that organic waste out of our waste stream, because if our goal is by 2050 we want to be a zero waste community, and organics make up a huge portion of that. So we want to think about really hard about how do we get food waste out of restaurants, but also out of people's homes. So stay tuned for more work on that for sure. But also C&D. There's just so many opportunities to reduce waste and reuse building materials. So we're going to have to put a lot of effort to get to that 60, to get to that zero waste by 2050. But getting to all these, achieving these goals and implementing these programs totally cannot happen by the city ourselves. If we went back to that little wedge analysis, you'd have to look really closely to see a very thin stripe of emissions that come just from city operations. So we can be a zero waste, zero emissions city operation, and it doesn't really move the needle. So we need to cooperate with all of the people who live in Portland. We need to cooperate with our business community to implement, the conservation measures and the renewable energy measures in their private properties to reach these goals. And we need to make sure that we, work with our partners at the state and federal government to make sure that we have good policies that make it possible to do the programs that we know we need to do to achieve these goals. So I mentioned earlier that 100% renewable portfolio standard that will have Maine use 100% clean electricity by 2050. That is totally essential. So we need to clean our grid. So we need to make sure that Maine stays the course and implements that that program. We need to make sure and advocate at the federal level for high standards for energy efficiency and gas mileage for vehicles. We need to look at programs that help provide access to capital for private people who need to invest in their community. So it kind of leads us to the big question of how do we pay for everything going forward, and that's not a small question. So in the commercial sector, we kind of looked at the heating in residences is oil, and it is in the private sector too. And the city isn't, and the state aren't going to be able to cut checks to pay for the private property owners to make those changes in their billing. So at least certainly in the very short term, we see our job number one is helping to create financing tools that can help businesses and commercial buildings and commercial building owners access capital and financing to make it possible to do that. So we've been advocating at the state level for last session, there was a bill that would create, it's called a Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy program, CPACE for short, that basically allows the city to use its authority to lien a property. That would be the security that a lender would be able to lend money to a property owner, a commercial property owner with basically no money down and for low interest, because they know that they'll be able to pay for they'll get their money back because if the business that borrowed the money defaulted, the city would be able to help them implement a lien on the property. So that's the security that makes that possible. But those are the types of tools and innovations that we need to see on the financing side to unleash capital, because a lot of the investments that need to be made are good investments. Weatherization, energy efficiency have a very good rate of return on investment, but a lot of people, homeowners and business owners, may not have the upfront capital, to do that. Maybe they can't afford a high down payment, or maybe a high interest rate will make their payments unaffordable. So, what are tools we can use to kind of put the lender and the prospective borrower together in a way that is win-win for both of them, and that's been really effective in different places across the country. So another tool that we're looking really closely at right now, again at the state level, and talking to colleagues at the state and in the business community, is creating what we're calling a green bank. So basically, it would take a modest amount of public funds to leverage investment from the private sector to basically create a pool of capital that could be used as credit enhancements, as grants, as low interest loans that people could access to be able to do this type of work. And again, the investors would be able to recoup their investment over time. And so we can look at that again, not only as a way to achieve clean energy goals, but also, again, we talked about it before, it's ways to create jobs, because this type of work, when you're working on buildings, it's got to be done by local people, earning a local paycheck and spending that money in their local communities. So that's definitely one of the bonuses of being able to do this type of work. And also, to put another perspective too, we know that if we don't do this type of work, it will be extremely expensive as well, because we know climate change is happening. We know sea levels are rising. Storms are getting worse. More intense rainstorms damage infrastructure, not just here on the coast, but also even inland. In fact, I saw a picture someone had shown me yesterday from Sunday River ski area. You remember we had these, very intense rainstorm the other night. Well, they had that in the mountains too, and a good part of the property at Sunday River, the slope got washed away by the heavy deluge. So, this type of weather event is a problem. It's all over the region, all over Maine. So everyone's going to be doing it, and everyone's going to bear expenses. And so the Climate Council actually commissioned a study as part of their work, and they determined that by 2050, coastal communities could have to spend over $17 billion just from damaged property from the effects of sea level rise. And they would also project that about 22,000 jobs would be lost in that time. And they also tried to calculate the impacts on budgets from having to address public health issues like we mentioned before, the Lyme disease and the high heat days. So people will be needing to get services, and that has a cost too. So as we think about the costs and we need to balance, the cost of doing nothing versus the costs of taking action now. And another thing, moving forward is we talked about how do we make a better future, make sure that we're thriving now and in the future. We thought about our colleagues in South Portland and our team thought about what makes a sustainable community and what do we mean by sustainability. And so you've probably seen something like this, so the three-legged stool or these interlocking rings that talks about social sustainability, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability. Without all three of these elements, it's just not sustainable. So just kind of put a little definition on what we're talking about. So we'll start with the social sustainability. So we know that a community that has social sustainability meets the needs of all of its members, regardless of race, ability, gender identity, education, or birth, or place of birth. So we imagine a future where all of our residents in Portland and South Portland, are able to participate in the civic and economic life of the community, and where everyone has access to safe, affordable housing, healthy food, and where you can live in a complete neighborhood, like we talked about before, where you can get around safely on foot, bicycle, and transit. We also wanted the economic sustainability portion is vital. We spent a little bit of time talking about that. But Portland and South Portland can become more sustainable by investing in and incentivizing businesses that align with our One Climate Future goals. So that means to us working to attract diverse businesses to locations where they can anchor those complete neighborhoods we talked about that are built near transit corridors, like near Woodford's Corner, where people can walk and shop nearby. And we also want to support locally owned businesses because we know that those types of businesses invest in the community. So they create local jobs and they create opportunities for money to circulate around Portland because local businesses typically hire other local businesses to provide the goods and services they need to operate. So that's just good for everybody. And we certainly want to be good stewards of public finances as a city government. So we want to make sure that we provide services really efficiently, make good use of the resources we have available to us, provided by the taxpayers. And we want to make sure that we make good decisions so that we don't increase property taxes and fees to a point that it makes it unaffordable. By making sure we keep a strong bond rating that will help us access, capital markets to be able to continue to borrow at an attractive rate, so we can, borrow to do the types of infrastructure investments that we know we're going to have to make to address sea level rise and the worst weather. And that type of preparation, again, is really good. That's a good investment because, dollars you spend on resilience and avoiding storm damage pay back in a magnitude of order more by avoiding lost property damages and other impacts in the future. So the World Economic Forum is suggesting that for every 3% of additional costs that you invest in your infrastructure, you see a huge rate of return. Every dollar you spend on resilience generates perhaps $4 to $6 of future economic value. So again, resilience is an investment in the future. And so finally, a lot of people, when you say sustainability, think of environmental sustainability. So we need to keep that in mind. Certainly, we talked about zero waste. We want to think about how can we create a circular economy, so people aren't consuming things in a way that depletes the natural resources on the planet. We have to keep working really hard to clean up our stormwater. We've been doing a lot of work on that in the last 10 years. Need to keep that up. We want to make sure that we're protecting our soils, and most importantly, we want to keep eliminating those carbon emissions so we can avert the worst impacts of climate change. And we talked about equity too. So part of that, we want to make sure that we look at neighborhoods that maybe haven't received the benefits that other neighborhoods have seen. So places like Bayside, for instance, very few trees there, much less in other parts of the city. So we want to make sure that all of our neighborhoods benefit from things like forest, tree forests, tree streets, the street trees, I should say, sorry, and other amenities that help reduce pollution and heat island effects. And ultimately, just kind of go back to this, or come to this great quote I found by renowned architect Peter Calthorpe. Because cities are our biggest opportunity to stop being wasteful of land, of energy, of materials, and of human potential. And that's really kind of, I think, encapsulates what we're trying to accomplish with One Climate Future. By creating a resilient city, striving to thrive in the ways that we just talked about, we really can create a future city that that we're all excited to live in, that meets the needs of all of our residents and is resilient against what we know will be some serious impacts of climate change. And if we can spend our time preparing for that and taking some of the measures we discussed, I think we can make sure that in 2050 we have a community that we're happy to live in as much as we are currently. So I think I'll leave it there. Take some questions.
Thank you, Troy. That was really great. It was so comprehensive, touching on so many different levels. I really appreciated from basically the ground up. So yeah, and we have some great questions. Great. So a question from Erno. Does the city have any shovel-ready climate change resilience projects to submit when the feds offer economic recovery funding?
So yes, the short answer is we do. So I know, and we actually have a list of things. Our Public Works Department keeps them. So FEMA has some programs that we always are paying close attention to. And so, we've been planning, a lot of them are related to stormwater because that's a big issue for us. Another slide deck, I have some pictures of some streets that were wiped out by some heavy deluges. So that's the type of thing that is a resilience issue for sure. And also, most people are familiar with how Bayside floods on super rainy days if there's a high tide. So, some measures to work on that. But also some things that maybe you wouldn't think of necessarily as resilience. But I know we have done a lot of work to catalog our sidewalks. And so in terms of equity and being able to promote walkable city, sidewalks are really important. So we have tallied up what it would take to improve the sidewalks and to make them ADA accessible. So that's a plan that is on the books. And if someone gave us $10 million to do that, we could start doing it next week. So yeah, we do have a bunch of stuff online. But in terms of like some of what you might think of as like heroic infrastructure, people talk about tide gates across, under Tukey's Bridge, and those are sorts of things everyone's sort of talked about them, but they're not planned out or engineered or anything like that yet.
Thank you. Another question from Althea. Does the city have plans for helping develop the workforce with these jobs? There simply aren't enough tradespeople available to do this work.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. As I know, some of the businesses that I talk to, like Revision Energy, for instance, literally had to create a training program to help people who wanted to learn how to be electricians. So they came on, maybe worked as a solar installer to lug panels to the electricians, and after work they would go and get trained so they could be an electrician. But that's a huge issue, and it's not just solar. Trades in general are a big issue. So it is a conversation that we're having. Not we have it's really statewide, not just in Portland. But as you recall, it's certainly at the top of people's mind. As you recall, in the Green New Deal citizen referendum, part of the component was to have worker training, and I think that was sort of a reference towards that. So it's a huge. It's huge. But I think as we think about trying to make the changes on the scale that we talked about, we're going to need to, create those opportunities for people.
Great, thank you. And just to stay on that for a minute, the Green New Deal, can you talk about how that impacts the climate work, or if there's any intersection, or sort of if there's anything for us to think about or pay attention to related to that?
So we're still, looking at all the referendum questions, including that one. But certainly the intent of the Green New Deal is to take climate action, and that's very much in line with the One Climate Future plan. They talked about creating better buildings. We talk about creating better buildings. And so, I think there's a lot of synergy there and a lot of overlap. Some of the elements in the Green New Deal referendum weren't things we talked about necessarily, but certainly parts of it we did talk about. So I think there's some good strong overlap there.
That's great. And then we have another question which you touched on, but maybe it's a more direct approach to the topic. So it's from Jean, and she says, Portland has a lot of really old housing stock. What can homeowners in these old buildings do to be more energy efficient? Mm-hmm. Seems kind of hard not to mention expensive to retrofit the best way. So if there are folks listening, like something they could do tomorrow, or
absolutely
how do you get started?
Yep, for sure. So the best thing people can do certainly is insulate and weatherize their homes. So I would definitely recommend people check out the Efficiency Maine website. There's a lot of programs through Efficiency Maine that provide financial assistance to people to do the work. There's incentives on different, things like heat pumps and different heating systems. There's assistance for weatherization. There's low interest loans that people can get. So that's a really great first stop for anybody, residents, but businesses as well, to take advantage of those programs. And the staff at Efficiency Maine is ready to help do that work. And again, that's talking about local jobs. That's another great connection, because Efficiency Maine works with local partners, contractors who they educate about the technologies and how to install them properly. So it's a win-win there as well.
Great. Well, I have a question. I, as you know, live on Peaks Island, and what are are there any conversations around the ferry landing docks, or any of the infrastructure related to climate? I know the back shore of Peaks is not long for this world, like the road is not long for this world. So are there thoughts about that? And as an islander, is there a way for me to be involved in any part of that conversation?
So sure. One of the real exciting things is the Casco Bay Ferry is getting a hybrid ferry that will use electricity a great deal. Some diesel certainly still, but it's really moving in the right direction. So we're excited about that. I've seen some different drawings for how to fix down front there on the landing area. Thinking there's still conversations. It's always a work in progress. But Peaks is certainly an important part of the city, and has some of those complete neighborhood components that we talked about too. Certainly, but yeah, there's a really active the the climate folks and the environmental folks on peaks, our environmental action team, are really engaged. We love working with them. So I guess certainly encourage people to stay involved with them. And we talk to Marianne and other folks who are in that group pretty often. So.
Great, thanks. And it looks like we have one more question, and it's just going back a little bit. If you could go back and talk about the water storage facility being installed by the Back Bay and sort of.
Sure. Yeah. So if you're going across from Hannaford on Preble Street Extension there, and as you go across the bridge, you see the big construction project. So that's actually it's a large storage conduit. So it basically takes stormwater that comes from different parts of the city and flows into pipes, and we're going to store it there until our water treatment plant is able to handle it. So what we have, this is a little complicated, but it's important for people to know because you're spending all that, your stormwater fee that you pay is paying for that. So we have a combined sewer system. So things, a lot of the, we're separating the sewer. So we're making, a stormwater line and a separate sewer line that goes to the plant. But we also have some storm lines that go into the plant and overflow it. So the wastewater treatment plant can only handle so much water before it just discharges without being treated. So all that stormwater going into it doesn't need to go all at once. So we are creating these large conduits that hold literally millions of gallons of water. And the one that's being built currently in Back Cove holds about 3 million gallons of water. Several years ago, we built another one on Baxter Boulevard, you might have remembered, down by Payson Park. That one holds 2 million gallons. And there are proposed 3 more of these tanks to be built over the next decade. But basically, they store the first inch of stormwater that falls on the ground. That's the most contaminated part. So it goes into these tanks, holds on to it, so the water treatment plant can continue to operate and treat the water. And then once the storm's over and the need, and the capacity rises at the treatment plant, we can turn pumps on and pump that water into the treatment plant so that it protects the water quality of Casco Bay. So it's a really important water quality measure.
That's great. I didn't see the original article about it, and I thought, oh my gosh, they're turning it into a parking lot or something.
Nope. So they'll put up the soccer field back after they get done with it.
Good. Awesome. Well, that's it for the questions. And just really thank you. Thank you for spending the evening with us. Really appreciate it. And for your last couple of years doing this, and for the amazing work that you have spearheaded and are so committed to. I mean, this would not have happened without you. You've really made this happen. And I just really want to thank you as a resident of Portland for your personal commitment to this.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. And we definitely appreciate the support from the residents and our counselors who are backing this up. So.
Great. Well, and thank you everybody else who joined us this evening. We will be having another sustainability series in January. As of yet, we are working on a speaker, but every month, 4th Wednesday, please stay tuned. So have a good evening and be safe.
Thanks, everyone.